And eventually, everybody who's going to be arrested got pardoned. President George Herbert Walker Bush, Reagan's vice president, pardoned them all, including Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. Oh, this was right to the very top of the Reagan administration. It showed something that's going to be a real problem down the road. If you have a lot of power and wealth, you can get off, not go to jail, not get indicted. In fact, now scot-free. So the election of 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush, or President Reagan's vice president, who was seen as he was kind of more moderate. He actually was not full trickle-down economics, but he would run for president. The Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, would run against him, and it really looked like Dukakis was going to win. But a few missteps by Dukakis, pretty racist campaign by Bush, and the Southern strategy, kind of shocking that it's called the Willie Horton ad. But Bush would win a very close election. Bush would win. I guess not very close, but fairly close. But Democrats still control the House and the Senate. The very next year, 1989, you could argue the Cold War ended. Gorbachev allowed for elections in Eastern Europe, and that snowballed to countries beginning to break away from behind the Iron Curtain, culminating with East Germany shocking everybody. East Germans walked through the Berlin Wall. East German border guards were ordered to shoot them, and they refused. The wall opened up, and people started crossing it, knocked it down. That poster from November 9th is the moment East Germany just crossed over to the West, and the Cold War just ended. And I still can't get over it. I still sometimes say West Germany or West Berlin. I say Czechoslovakia all the time, even though that country died with the Cold War. Hey, it's what we learned. It's still an amazing moment when the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union would collapse in 1991. And the thought was now peace. The Cold War is over. We can end the arms race. The United States can argue won, even though it wasn't quite a full victory, but there'll be peace. No more war. I'm lying. Of course, there's going to be war. The number of wars will go up dramatically. And the United States is going to be at constant war, full-scale war from 1990 on. The wars continue. Part of the issue about being the only superpower, at least until now, the U.S. has the most powerful military, and what do you do with it when you have a military? You use it. And, well, okay, so let's get to the first war, the Gulf War. There's actually two Gulf Wars. In 1980 to 1989, Iran and Iraq fought a bloody, stalemated war that over 1 million people would be killed or wounded. Iraq attacked Iran after the Islamic Revolution, partially because of that. The U.S. supported Iraq and Iran. That was all part of the weapons. But we supported the government of Saddam Hussein. Not completely the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And then in 1990, Iraq, assuming that the U.S. didn't care because the U.S. was not an ally of Kuwait, they invaded Kuwait because they were broke after the war. Basically, they were trying to scoop up their oil left, this little sheikdom in Kuwait. They expected the United States to not care, which the U.S. ambassador said, we do not care. It turned out this was a direct threat to American oil interests in the Middle East, especially American oil companies that were pumping oil out of Saudi Arabia. Thus, the U.S. was furious. And that's going to lead to the second Gulf War that we lumped together with the Persian Gulf War. And the United States went to Saudi Arabia. And actually our Secretary of State, or our Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, lied to the Saudis and said Iraq is about ready to invade Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not a very populous country. And so they would have been overwhelmed. They were not going to invade Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia panicked and allowed the United States to send troops into Saudi Arabia for the first time in history. Now, Saudi Arabia is a very important country to the Islamic world. It has never had an occupying army in Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry, a non-Islamic occupying army in Saudi Arabia since the beginning of Islam. Even during World War I, when the British helped an Arab rebellion down here, they only sent advisors, never regular troops. Why? What is the most holy city in the Islamic world? Mecca. Now, I spelled it the English style. You also see it spelled as M-E-K-K-A-H. I can't help it. This is how I learned it. But Mecca. Now, there were many, especially more fundamentalist Sunni Muslims, who said this is going to be an avenue to take Mecca, including former Saudi citizens, like this guy named Osama bin Laden, would infuriate him. And remember, he's in Al Qaeda. He's still in Afghanistan. Infuriate him. I can't begin to tell you what a big deal this was. Most Americans did not realize it because, various cultural and ethnic or news blackout, various things like that. Also, so in 1991, the U.S. and over 30 allies attacked to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, called Operation Desert Storm. And it's going to be U.S., but the British, the French, 39 countries sent troops. This was a massive coalition, basically to make sure the oil lines stayed open, but also political. War sometimes helps presidents. And the Iraqi army, although experienced, all their best troops, Saddam Hussein kept around him up here. And he put a bunch of Iraqi untrained. Actually, Saddam Hussein is Sunni Muslim. The majority population is Shia. They put most of these Shia Muslims here who surrendered right away. They just surrendered. And when they tried to evacuate out of Kuwait, this is called the Road of Death. U.S., British, and French planes caught them on this road and killed tens of thousands. Slaughterhouse. It was beyond belief awful. Iraq was pushed out, but they left Saddam Hussein in power. Why? The Bush administration in 1991 knew if Saddam Hussein is out of power, there'll be a power vacuum in Iraq and that'll lead to civil war. So they cannot push him out. Two things. First off, Saddam Hussein then immediately told everybody he won. I survived, I won, which infuriated members of the Bush administration. And secondly, many members of that first Bush administration become members of Bush's son's administration, and they would attack Iraq. And it would turn into an awful quagmire, just like they knew in 1991. So, back to this. Partially out of humiliation because of this, the United States kept really strong economic sanctions, made it almost impossible to import anything into Iraq, which has been at war since 1980. And so Iraq never really rebuilt after the destruction of the war. And because of the lack of medical supplies, because of this, the Iraqis say 500,000 Iraqis died because of the sanction over the last over 10 years. It's probably closer to 300,000, mostly children and the elderly. But this is really awful sanctions. So Iraq is now a weak country under sanction, even though Saddam Hussein still lived in Russia. But for President Bush, his political, we want a war, yay! His political upswing did not last long. A recession started in 1991 and lasted a really long time. Unlike previous depressions of the 67 or 50s, 70s, and 80s that were short, this is the decrease of the GDP. It lingered for 3 years, and presidents are blamed for bad economy. Sometimes they deserve all the blame, sometimes they don't deserve much. Bush got the blame. This implies it was bad as the Great Depression. That's supposed to be tying the two together. It was not, but it definitely hurt Bush's chance for re-election. In 1992, the Democrats ran a conservative neoliberal by the name of Bill Clinton from Arkansas. Here's Bill Clinton, his running mate, Tennessee Senator Al Gore. The Republicans renominated George Herbert Walker Bush, but who was unpopular now. And a third party started by Texas oilman, a billionaire by the name of Ross Perot, called the Reform Party, jumped in. And the big thing was anti-trade deficit. The United States was importing more and more as it began to deindustrialize. Well, the election was close. This one, the Democrats are red. The Democrats are red. So a few southern states went because Bill Clinton was from Arkansas. Montana voted for Clinton. It's the last time Montana voted for a Democrat. Montana was a radically different state today than it was then. But it almost voted for Clinton in 96, and there was only a couple thousand votes for voting for Obama in 2008. And it was pretty close for the next few elections, and then the last two have been overwhelmingly Republican. But back to this. Bill Clinton won a big victory, even though Perot got almost 19% of the vote. And he was a neoliberal, very openly conservative, economically conservative. And this will happen right away, how conservative he was economic in one of the first major actions by his Congress. The Bush administration negotiated a treaty called, I almost forgot. There's Bill Clinton, and his wife Hillary Clinton. She would later become senator from New York and Secretary of State. Here he is in Billings, campaigning in 1992. About an hour after that, I shook his hand. The first of 3 times I shook Bill Clinton's hand. The first time is actually a really good story. The second one's not that great. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was negotiated by President Bush, but Clinton came out for it because it needed to be ratified by the Senate. Most Democrats were opposed, but Clinton threw his support with Republicans, and it got passed just barely. This would be bitterly divisive for the Democratic Party. So what was free trade meant? Add this part, I didn't put it down. Get rid of tariffs. No tariffs in North America, meaning no tariffs between Mexico, US, and Canada. The thought was it will open up the big Mexican and Canadian market. Mexico's a massive country. Open it up for American goods. It was sold as this will create jobs in America because factories will start up in the United States and sell their goods in Canada and Mexico, and also help farms. Is that what happened? No. What happened is US companies took advantage of the lack of tariffs, and companies like GM took half their production, closed down factories up here, and built factories in Mexico. And the trade deficit, the gap between imports and exports, went up. And it's going to go up every year since. There'll be a few little blips. The deficit now is at a record high. It went down a tiny bit under Biden, but under President Trump, it's gone up a lot. But anyways, that's not. And it caused more than that. It also devastated rural Mexico. So Mexico had a bunch of small independent farmers, and they were destroyed by a glut of cheap American imported corn. Just destroyed Mexican farmers who couldn't keep up. Millions of Mexican farmers lost their farms or became completely bankrupt. And what's that going to lead to? Well, you got to survive somewhere, don't you? And that is going to trigger a wave of desperate Mexicans going north to the United States, mostly as undocumented immigrants. Devastated by NAFTA. Has everyone got that? What do we call anti-immigrant feeling again? Do you remember? And this is going to trigger a huge wave of nativism that would go on to this day. The biggest wave of Latin American immigrants will come right here. Okay, this part you don't have to write down, but there'll be another free trade agreement called CAFTA, Central American. Basically, it's Guatemala down to Panama. And guess what's going to happen in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras? Same kind of thing. Small farmers are going to be devastated, and in the teens of the 2000s, they're going to come north. This will be a big part of President Trump's campaign in 2016 and 2024. anti-immigrant feeling, and so much of it was caused by NAFTA and CAFTA. In President Trump's first term, he said he was going to get rid of all the bad parts of NAFTA. They signed a new agreement called the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. It actually was basically NAFTA with a different name. And that's the agreement today, even though in the current Trump administration, he has violated his own treaty a number of times, but now they've kind of gone back to it in a strange holding pattern. That's in signing NAFTA. What was the result of this? The result would be startling. It's going to forever change the United States. But the first thing you'll notice that gutted the Democrats. In '94, the Democrats got crushed. They're blamed for this treaty, even though the effects haven't really hit yet, and they never recovered. This is going to show the Democrats, and then in 2008, even more seats are going to be lost. But manufacturing jobs are going to go down, and you really see it accelerate in the 2000s. Union membership dropped like a rock, and that's where you start getting the term Rust Belt. What's the Rust Belt? All the old industrial states like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, all the way to Iowa, but also some southern states, factories shut their doors. And if you go to these medium-sized towns that were built around one factory, when a factory shuts their doors, like a Caterpillar factory making tractors just shut their doors in Indiana, what's going to happen to a town of 50,000 people if 4,000 people are employed in one factory if they shut their doors? The town's dead. Kills it. It's just gone. And that's what happened. You see the same thing to a lesser degree in Montana, rural Montana, when the farm economy crashed in the 1980s, and rural Montana just crashed. I saw it personally. I lived in Miles City. Miles City lost 3,000 people over a 10-year period. So you go from 11,000 to 8,000 people. That's a gutting of a town. And you go to all these little small towns in Montana. Similar. You go to Ohio, you see it. There's a lot of anger. Democrats never recovered. So they still don't know what to do. The election of 1996, though, this is still kind of hidden. Clinton was personally popular, and there was a tech boom. So Clinton would run against the Republican senator from Kansas named Bob Dole. Bob Dole had been in the Senate forever, in the 1960s. He ran as Ford's vice president way back in 1976. And now he's running for president in 1996. Ross Perot jumped in again, but the Reform Party didn't have the kind of oomph it had in 1992. And so this one, Green is Republican. It was close in Montana. Remember, elections, presidential elections, it's not a national election. It's an election in each state, and whoever wins, wins all the electoral votes. Bill Clinton won a pretty handy victory. Not huge, but a good victory. And Bill Clinton was reelected. But Democrats are not doing well nationwide. And his second term, though, would be impaired by everybody right down the Clinton impeachment. So Clinton's enemies back to Arkansas. It's amazing how many enemies Clinton had. I think for so many reasons. I think partially because he's a very talented politician with a massive head. But his head... But pink. And they're trying to find dirt on a land deal that Clinton's associates were involved in Arkansas. And when Republicans took over control of the House, they did an investigation of Clinton, trying to find anything, looking for a way to get him. Now, they didn't find anything on him. Clinton was kind of involved. It was a little slimy, but I mean, seems almost quaint today. But he has to do a deposition, which is a legal procedure. And in the middle of the deposition, shocking everybody, they got news. They got information. They kept it secret. They asked Clinton, are you having an affair with an intern by the name of Monica Lewinsky? And Clinton said, no. That's a lie in a deposition. That is a felony. And that would be the excuse to impeach. Now, let's get back to this. What Clinton did, I'm going to take my, I don't think it's a really controversial bias here. It was scummy as scummy can be. Okay, having an affair, people's personal life, okay. But also, this is an intern, he's the president. Taking advantage of someone who's an underling and using your position of authority to take advantage of them, that's scummy as scummy can be. So that's what Clinton did. But what the Republicans did is they wanted to stop Clinton. And so they used a personal affair to try to use a political process to get him out of office. And even though all it took was a majority, and the Republicans controlled the House, and the Democrats were gutted in '94, they got the impeachment. The majority of Americans were furious, and Clinton's approval rating actually went up dramatically because of the impeachment. Because they saw it as unfair and abuse of power what Republicans were doing to try to get rid of Clinton for a personal affair, regardless of the fact that most people thought it was scummy. So you have this weird phenomenon of Clinton and the impeachment for an affair, and its approval rating went up. But still, Democrats were still had to deal with this awful thing. So he did not get convicted in the Senate. Clinton will be the second president to be impeached. Remember, the first one was Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president. Nixon was not impeached, as I mentioned, as I told you before, and you already knew. Trump was impeached twice. But remember, still has to go to the Senate for trial. So, Clinton's legacy. There was a tech boom, and it seemed like productivity, everything had changed. It was not near as productive as people thought, and the wealth gap actually went up. But Clinton showed his conservative views, but with a series of deregulatory actions, most famously, the most important one of the most important actions in history. Bill Clinton, he supported it with all Republicans, almost no Democrats voted for repealing Glass-Steagall. And that ended the biggest deregulation or biggest regulation on banks. It allowed investment banks, which are like Wall Street banks, to combine with commercial banks like the bank down the street, who does Stockman's Bank or Valley Bank that does like car loans, etc. Allowed them to unify. It's going to create massive bank monopolies that will wager people's savings and commercial debt in big stock market gambles called mortgage-backed securities. But anyways, also in 2000, the tech bubble crashed, and the idea that the internet is going to be this egalitarian thing for everybody, no, it just became a bunch of monopolies, which is what it is now. But I should add, when this deregulation happened, it took the banks less than 8 years to blow up the entire world's economy and nearly destroy the financial system of the world. That's not bad in 8 years. You got to admit. I would have said 12, maybe 13 years, but only 8. That's impressive. Can it happen again? Absolutely. Absolutely. These regulations are still gone. So, and that's Bill Clinton afterwards. Oh, the reason I'm showing you that is his wife, who became a senator and then Secretary of State. She ran for president in 2008, did not get the Democratic nomination, but he came to Helena campaign for his wife. Then in 2016, after she was Secretary of State, Bill Clinton came to Helena again and campaigned in 2016. Anybody know where he is? Know where that is? You've been in it. That's the gym. He was here twice. Yes, that's the second and third times I showed Bill Clinton. Not really. That was more like, he didn't remember me from '92. That kind of surprised me. Hey, don't you remember me from Rocky Mountain College? Okay, so in 1980, the election of 1980, everyone put down 1980. Did I say 1980? Why am I saying 1980? 2000. The election of 2000. George Bush's son, George W. Bush, who was kind of a dark, kind of had a dark cloud over him. They called him for a while a fail son. He had become a drug addict, had all these issues, avoided the draft in Vietnam, but then rehabilitated himself. He became governor of Texas, also very openly evangelical, born again. He got the Republican nomination. The Democrats nominated Clinton's vice president, Al Gore. But Al Gore had a problem, and they never knew how to deal with it. Clinton was personally popular, but they didn't want to campaign with Clinton because of the Monica Lewinsky thing was still hanging because of that scummy affair. And so Gore ran a very weird campaign, kind of a half campaign. And when the election finally happened, most of the polls had Gore slightly ahead, but it was going to be razor thin, one of those a late night one. Well, Gore would win the popular vote, but remember that doesn't matter. It all came to one swing state, Florida. And Florida was razor thin, but a brand new television network called Fox News called Florida for Gore. Do you know how they do it? So when networks and like the Associated Press, like newspapers call elections, so if you go vote on election day, and now they do it also, they'll call you if you voted before. Let's say you vote on election day. When you walk out, there are, including in Helena, there are people from a couple different television networks and probably the Associated Press standing out there taking a poll. And they'll ask you who you voted for. It's called exit poll. And they'll get the exit polls. And then they agree to not release those exit polls after the polls close. And if the polls close and it was clear from the exit polling, one candidate won a huge victory, which they can tell, they'll call it. When it's close, they wait and let the numbers come in and see if it matches their exit poll. What Fox News says, it matched their exit polling and Bush won Florida. Bush declared victory, won the election. But nobody else really declared it. And Fox later retracted it because the election was far too close. They did not finish counting to the middle of the night. And it turned out, think about Florida's a massive state. And Bush won by 130 votes, but there were a bunch of irregularities. That's less than 0.1% difference of the total vote. It immediately goes to a recount. And there are all kinds of issues with ballots, that they miscounted, didn't count ballots. I mean, all kinds of problems. So a recount. And the Bush people try to stop the recount. And that's going to trigger a month and a half of debate over Florida. You might remember when Reconstruction ended in 1876, one of the states that sent 2 sets of electors was Florida. So back to this. Over and over again, they kept showing this map. The networks all agreed they would switch blue and red for whoever won each state in election. 1996, the Democrats were red, the Republicans were blue. In 2000, the Democrats were blue, the Republicans were red. And so imagine this map being blue and red on the TV over and over again for a month and a half. If Florida contested. That's where you get the blue state, red state thing. So it went in with them a recount. The Bush administration stopped it. This is making fun of Truman, making fun of the recount with Truman's whole thing of doing wins. Back and forth. The recount was started. There's all kinds of issues of these old punch card ballots, and the Bush administration or the Bush campaign sued the Gore campaign to stop the recount and went to the Supreme Court. This is one of the ballots. Trying to figure out if they actually did vote. It was crazy. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to stop the recount and give the election. And this was such a controversial ruling that in the ruling itself, it says this case can never be used as a precedent for future cases because it's too controversial. It is a shocking thing to basically say we're just not going to count the votes. Now, since they've never done a formal recount, there's only been a few from a few counties. Gore probably won, but doesn't matter. Bush was president, chosen by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to take more and more power over our life. What's interesting, 3 of Bush's lawyers to try to stop the recount, 3 of them are now all 3 on the Supreme Court now, all appointed by President Trump. They were all on Bush's campaign. So interesting thing how this we're all kind of connected by a few little group of people in power. So I just thought this was funny, so I stuck it in their way on math. So don't write, just put down terrorism. I'm not going to make you know the attacks, but there's a wave of high-profile terrorist attacks, even though the amount of terrorism actually dropped like a rock from the 1970s. Here, For example, the first attack by a group called the Muslim Brotherhood on the World Trade Center was in 1993, killing almost 200 people. They packed a bunch of explosives into a van and tried to blow up in the parking garage of the World Trade Center. That didn't work. Maybe plan B, huh? Domestic terrorists, right-wing terrorists killed over 200 in Oklahoma City. Al Qaeda then did a series of attacks. The U.S. remained in Saudi Arabia. Remember Mecca? U.S. soldiers were based, mostly Air Force personnel in Khobar Towers. It was bombed, killing 20 people. The U.S. embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya, were attacked by Al Qaeda. And a suicide bomber attacked a U.S. destroyer in Oman. Literally, a little speedboat packed with explosives rammed into the destroyer, nearly sunk it. Modern ships are really hard to sink. They're able to save it. It's still in service today. But all these attacks. And so when Bush became president, you had this issue of terrorism. A month before the attack, he was warned in a document for his national security team, Osama bin Laden determined to attack the United States. He ignored it. He ignored it. He was more worried about China. Looked like we might go to war with China in 2001. How things just never seem to change. So, September 11th, 2001. I can't go into every detail. Special topics, I do either very quick or sometimes very long units on this. This is an amazing story. So Al Qaeda, we know, is in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden is from Saudi Arabia. Is still in Afghanistan. There's maybe 2,000 Al Qaeda. Almost all of them are from Saudi Arabia, known for very radical Sunni Muslims called the Wahhabis. And they began planning this attack. And before you write this down, I'll tell you, in 1998, they planned to attack Paris first by hijacking planes and flying them into like the Eiffel Tower and other big French spots. Hijacking a plane and using it as a bomb was not new. It did not take U.S. intelligence by surprise, even though they claim it would afterwards because everyone's trying to, act like they weren't responsible. They gave 4 reasons why. The first reason was there was U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Mecca. They're trying to destroy Islam. 2, the U.S. supported dictators and still supports dictators all over, especially the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, everywhere. This will be one of your short items. One of the ones that I really like you to answer. Did everyone catch my hint there? Did everyone catch my hint? No, the reasons there. This is one of mine. I have to be very generous for you. Next. By the way, does U.S. still support dictators? Of course. Dictators all over there. Next. Aid for Israel. Israel, which was created in 1948, and to the Arab world, this is seen as pure colonization by mostly Europeans into Israel, and most were coming from Israel to take land there, and treatment of Palestinians who were kicked off of their land and living in squalid refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza. Yes, that still goes on. And then lastly, the massive sanctions on Iraq. But I didn't put this down. Why is the U.S. doing? More importantly, what did Al Qaeda say is the reason U.S. did these 4 things? And that's what you have to have yourself. Wealth, money, oil. They just want money. All the U.S. cares about is their own financial gain. The World Trade Center, which no one in New York really liked, in fact, 20% of it was empty because it was so expensive. The World Trade Center is a center of financial power, at least to the Arab world. They saw that. That's why they targeted there. Because they said the U.S. did this because all they care about is money, and they let us all go die in Afghanistan. They hadn't forgotten, for their own money. So the plan was to hijack 4 planes. They sent hijackers over. Originally, it's going to be 5 people on each plane, but one of them got caught, couldn't get over. They're almost all Saudis. Almost every one of the hijackers were Saudi Arabians. And intelligence picked up a lot of strange things, but like the FBI wasn't talking to the National Security Agency or the CIA. They weren't talking to each other. So they blew a number of opportunities. They should have been coming. Without a doubt, should have been coming. Massive screws. A perfect storm had to happen for them to make this happen. It all seemed to work out. Like, for example, a bunch of guys were going into flight training, flight simulators, and openly saying, we don't care how to land. We just want to know how to take off and steer. Yes, they should have figured it out. They knew. One guy was arrested and then it went nowhere in Minneapolis. But anyways, why did they do this? They wanted the US to lash out and attack. So they can say, told you so. All they care about is their wealth and power and oil. That's all they care about, and they will kill and maim everybody. Remember the Tea Party? The Patriots did the Tea Party because they wanted the British to do the coercing acts. This is political action. You see similar things down the road. Now, this is psychotic, but that's what they wanted, and that's what the US would do. So, 4 planes would be hijacked, 4 targets, the 2 trade centers, the Capitol, and the White House. Those were the 4 targets. The first 2 planes that are going to be hijacked were hijacked from Logan Airport. So I've been to Logan Airport, and it is the 2nd worst airport I've ever been in my life. It is one of the most confusing, awfully designed places. That security all bottlenecks, and so it's really just this mass of people that it explodes out. A perfect place to sneak in. But I should add, 2001, there was not near the restrictions. There was a metal detector, and they knew about bombs because bombing and hijacking goes back. There's a big wave of hijacking in the 70s. But you can carry all kinds of stuff on a plane. In June 2001, my wife and I backpacked across Europe. For 7 weeks, all we had was a backpack. We carried in our backpack, went across Europe in 7 weeks. And we knew, okay, we're trying to save money. We're going to do things like picnic camps. We brought a bunch of things so we could prepare food for ourselves. I had 2 knives in my bag, both of them had 4-inch blades. One knife specifically to cut bread, and one knife to cut like cheese and sausage. I mean, I remember this. My wife had 1 blade and scissors. It wasn't that big of a deal at all. Not even. Didn't even get a look at. So when anybody know what the hijackers used? They snuck in box cutters. No one even looked. No one even looked. It's kind of weird looking back, remembering flying in 2001 and what's going to change to this day. Most of the security is performative, but still, that's why it all came about. So, the first plane, and that's the first plane. And I heard it on the radio while getting ready for work. In fact, it was on National Public Radio, had that on. And I remember them saying a single engine private plane hit the World Trade Center. That's what they heard, because no one could imagine. Just couldn't imagine this commercial airline hitting it. Then 10 minutes later, it's like, oh, maybe might have been a commercial airline. And I remember thinking, got to school, and I was in Mr. Solomon's classroom. Now it's Mr. Solomon's classroom. He wasn't a teacher. It was Mr. Sims, former teacher who's retired. That's he watched it on his TV. We're watching it. And that's when you knew, oh my God. The next plane was, that's World Trade Center being hit. The first plane hit pretty high, the second plane lower, and that's why the second one collapsed first. That's the second one. Fortunately, they were able to evacuate most of the people in the lower floors, but it was also before the 9 o'clock normal time to start work. And so the towers weren't full. And so I can remember at noon, they were saying maybe 10 to 15,000 people died. Fortunately, just because they couldn't communicate with people on their way to work. It was awful, but a little bit less than 3,000 died. It's still the second bloodiest day in American history after the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War. That's when it crashed. It was like a nuclear bomb. And all the health things that happened with that, it was unreal. The next plane